The morning sun filtered through the hospital room blinds as I watched my family gather around what they thought was my deathbed. 3 months of careful planning had led to this moment, the culmination of years watching them circle like vultures, waiting for their inheritance. My breathing was shallow, monitored by machines that would soon flatline according to the meticulous script I'd orchestrated with Dr. Martinez, my most trusted ally in this elaborate deception. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She's fading fast, whispered my sister Diana, though her voice carried more anticipation than grief. She stood at the foot of the bed, clutching her Hermès bag like a shield, her designer heels clicking nervously against the linoleum floor. Beside her, my nephew Marcus scrolled through his phone, probably calculating real estate values for the estate he thought would soon be his. My husband Richard sat in the corner, maintaining the perfect image of the grieving spouse, while secretly texting his mistress. I could see the screen's reflection in his reading glasses. Won't be long now. We can finally be together. The irony was delicious. After 25 years of marriage, he thought he was about to inherit everything I'd built, unaware that I'd discovered his affair 6 months ago and had been planning this moment ever since. Should we call Father McKinnon? Asked my daughter-in-law Charlotte, though her concern seemed more focused on appearing appropriate than actual reverence. She'd married my son David 3 years ago, and I'd watched her systematically try to turn him against me, poisoning every family gathering with subtle comments about my controlling nature and outdated values. David himself stood by the window, staring out at the parking lot. My heart ached seeing him there. My only child, the one person I'd hoped would remain untainted by greed. But even he had changed since Charlotte entered his life, becoming distant and calculating. Last month, I'd overheard them discussing how quickly they could sell the family business once I was gone. The machines began their programmed sequence, alarms blaring as my vital signs deteriorated. Dr. Martinez rushed in, playing his part perfectly. He'd been my physician for 15 years and had watched my family's behavior with growing disgust. When I'd approached him with my plan, he'd agreed immediately, not just because of our friendship, but because he believed in justice. "I'm sorry," he announced solemnly after several minutes of theatrical medical intervention. Evelyn Chambers passed away at 9:47 a.m. The silence that followed was telling. No gasps of grief, no tears, just a moment of suspended calculation before the performance began. Diana was the first to sob, her designer tissues already prepared. Richard covered his face with his hands, though I caught the slight smile he thought no one could see. Charlotte immediately began comforting David, who seemed genuinely shocked despite everything. "What do we do now?" Marcus asked, his voice barely containing his excitement. "There are arrangements to be made," Richard said, suddenly taking charge with practiced authority. "The funeral home, the lawyer, the will reading." His voice trailed off, and I could practically see dollar signs in his eyes. I remained perfectly still as they filed out to begin their charade of mourning. Only Dr. Martinez stayed behind, checking to ensure the coast was clear before helping me sit up and disconnect the monitoring equipment we'd rigged to simulate my death. "Phase 1 complete," he whispered, handing me a change of clothes from the bag hidden behind the medical cart. "Your pulse suppressant will wear off in another hour, but the death certificate is already being processed through our contact at the county office." I stretched carefully, working circulation back into my limbs. The drugs Dr. Martinez had administered to slow my heart rate and breathing had left me feeling weak, but the adrenaline of what we'd accomplished was already reviving me. And the body? Margaret Thornfield's corpse arrived an hour ago. Advanced cancer, similar build, no next of kin. She's been prepared and will be transported to the funeral home this afternoon. By the time anyone sees her, she'll be unrecognizable. I thought of Margaret, a lonely woman who died in the charity ward. Dr. Martinez had convinced her weeks before her death to participate in our plan. Her final act would be helping expose the greed of people she'd never met. In exchange, I'd arranged for a proper burial and a substantial donation to the causes she'd cared about. Your family is already downstairs making arrangements, Dr. Martinez continued. Richard insisted on a closed casket, citing your dignity and their grief. Convenient, considering he was just texting his girlfriend about vacation plans. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I pulled on the simple black dress and wig that would complete my transformation from Evelyn Chambers, deceased matriarch, to Elena Cortez, grieving family friend. Over the next week, I would attend my own funeral, watch my family's true colors emerge, and position myself perfectly for the will reading that would change everything. The elevator ride down to the hospital lobby felt surreal. Nurses and orderlies who had just seen me die now looked through me as if I were invisible. The disguise was working perfectly. Years of careful weight loss, cosmetic alterations, and practice had created a persona so different from Evelyn Chambers that even people who knew me well wouldn't recognize Elena Cortez. In the lobby, I could see my family clustered around Richard as he spoke with the funeral director. Their body language told the complete story. The eager forward lean of people discussing an inheritance, the careful positioning to appear appropriately grieved for any observers, the subtle but unmistakable excitement barely contained beneath their masks of sorrow. Mrs. Chambers was a remarkable woman, the funeral director was saying. I'm sure you'll want to honor her memory with appropriate arrangements. Of course, Richard replied smoothly, though she was always practical about expenses. Nothing too extravagant. I almost laughed. Richard was already penny-pinching with what he thought was his money. Diana stepped forward, her voice dripping with false emotion. Actually, Mother always said she wanted the finest of everything. We should spare. No expense for her final farewell. The two siblings exchanged a look that spoke volumes. They were already disagreeing about how to spend their inheritance. I moved closer, pulling out my phone to record their conversation. Every word would be useful evidence later. The hidden cameras Dr. Martinez and I had placed throughout the hospital had captured hours of footage, but I wanted to document every moment of their deception personally. The will reading is scheduled for next Friday, Richard was explaining to the funeral director. We'll need everything settled by then. Another tell. Most grieving families aren't thinking about legal proceedings within hours of a death. But Richard had clearly been planning this conversation for months. I followed them to the parking lot, watching as they immediately broke character once they thought they were alone. Diana's tears vanished instantly, replaced by a calculating hardness. I'd seen too often in recent years. Did you see how much equipment they had in there? Marcus was saying. All those medical bills are going to come out of the estate. Don't worry about it, Richard assured him. Evelyn had excellent insurance, and the business is worth more than enough to cover everything. The casual way he discussed my supposed death was chilling. 25 years of marriage, and I'd become nothing more than a financial transaction. Charlotte was already on her phone. I'm calling the real estate agent. We need to get the house appraised immediately. The house where I'd raised David, where we'd celebrated holidays and milestones, was already being carved up for sale. Wait, David said quietly. Shouldn't we wait until after the funeral? It feels wrong to be discussing this so soon. Oh, honey, Charlotte cooed, her voice sickeningly. Sweet, your mother would understand. She was always practical about business matters. The manipulation was so smooth I almost admired her technique. She'd been working on David for years, gradually poisoning his relationship with me while positioning herself as the voice of reason. David's right, Diana said, though her agreement seemed strategic rather than genuine. We need to maintain appearances until after the will reading. Then we can discuss dividing the assets properly. Richard nodded, though I could see his impatience. Of course. 1 week of mourning, then we handle the business side. He turned to the group, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he'd used whenever he tried to override my decisions during our marriage. I'll coordinate with the lawyers. Diana, you handle the funeral arrangements. Charlotte and David, start going through the house for anything valuable that needs to be secured. I watched them drive away in their separate cars, each already plotting their individual strategies for maximizing their share of what they believed would be substantial inheritance. What they didn't know was that I'd been documenting their greed for months, building a case that would ensure none of them received a penny. The Chambers estate was worth approximately $12 million. The family business I'd built from nothing over 30 years was valued at another $8 million. The house, cars, and investments brought the total to nearly $22 million. Enough to make even close family members turn predatory. But what Richard and the others didn't know was that 6 months ago, when I'd first discovered his affair, I'd begun quietly restructuring everything. Working with a team of lawyers they'd never met, I'd created a new will that would shock them all. More importantly, I'd been laying the groundwork for a complete transformation of my identity, one that would allow me to disappear from Evelyn Chambers' life entirely while maintaining control of everything I'd built. Dr. Martinez had been crucial to the medical aspects of the plan, but the legal and financial elements had required a different kind of expertise. That's where Maria Santos came in, a brilliant attorney who specialized in complex estate planning and had her own reasons for wanting to see justice done. Her own family had been destroyed by similar greed when her father died, leaving her sympathetic to my situation and committed to helping me expose the truth. As I drove to the safe house I'd prepared months earlier, I reflected on the irony of the situation. My family thought they were finally free of my controlling influence, ready to claim their rewards for years of false affection and careful manipulation. Instead, they'd just triggered the most elaborate revenge plan I'd ever conceived. Thai. Safe House was a modest apartment in a neighborhood none of them would ever visit, rented under Elena Cortez's carefully constructed identity. Over the next week, Elena would become a trusted family friend of the late Evelyn Chambers, someone who'd known her for years and wanted to pay her respects. Elena would attend the funeral, visit the grieving family, and establish herself as a credible witness to their behavior. Inside the apartment, I'd created a command center that would make any investigator proud. Multiple monitors displayed feeds from cameras placed throughout my house, my business, and even some locations my family frequented. Audio recording equipment captured their phone calls and conversations. Financial tracking software monitored their accounts for any suspicious activity. The extent of their deception was already becoming clear. Within hours of my death, Richard had called his mistress to arrange a weekend getaway to deal with his grief. Diana had contacted 3 different real estate agents to get competing appraisals of my property. Marcus had started researching luxury cars, apparently planning his first major purchase with his expected inheritance. But the most painful revelation was watching David and Charlotte at my house that evening. Through the hidden cameras, I observed them going through my personal belongings with the clinical efficiency of professional estate cleaners. Photographs that represented decades of memories were sorted into valuable and trash piles. My mother's china was immediately packed for Charlotte's apartment. My father's war medals disappeared into David's pocket. "Look at all this jewelry," Charlotte said, examining my collection with obvious delight. "Most of it is outdated, but the stones are valuable." She was referring to pieces Richard had given me for anniversaries and birthdays, jewelry that had once symbolized love, but was now just another asset to be liquidated. "Mom would want you to have them," David said, though his voice lacked conviction. He was trying to convince himself as much as his wife. "Of course she would," Charlotte agreed smoothly. "She always said family was most important." The lie was so brazen I had to pause the recording and take a moment to compose myself. I'd never said anything of the kind to Charlotte. In fact, I'd made it clear in several conversations that the jewelry should go to my goddaughter, Sarah, who'd been like a daughter to me since her own mother died. The week progressed with clockwork precision. Each day brought new revelations about my family's true character, and each day I documented everything meticulously. Richard moved his mistress into our house within 72 hours of my death, claiming she was there to help with his grief. Diana began liquidating my art collection through private sales, telling potential buyers she needed quick cash for funeral expenses. Marcus started rumors about my mental state in his final years, laying groundwork for a potential challenge to the will if it didn't favor him sufficiently. Meanwhile, Elena Cortez established herself as a legitimate presence in their lives. I attended the wake, sitting in the back and observing their performance for the gathered mourners. The eulogies were masterpieces of false emotion, each speaker outdoing the others in describing my supposed virtues while their eyes calculated the audience's reaction. Richard spoke last, his voice trembling with perfectly practiced grief. Evelyn was the light of my life, he said, dabbing at tears that had appeared on cue. She built something remarkable with her business, something that will continue her legacy long after we're gone. The emphasis on continue was subtle but clear. He was already positioning himself as the natural successor to lead the company. Diana followed with stories about our childhood, painting herself as the devoted sister who'd always supported my dreams. The reality was quite different. She'd been trying to undermine me since we were children, always jealous of any success or recognition I received. Now she was rewriting history to position herself as the grieving family member most deserving of sympathy and inheritance. Even David's eulogy was tainted by Charlotte's influence. Every anecdote had been carefully chosen to emphasize his role as the dutiful son who would honor my memory by continuing the family traditions. The subtext was clear. He saw himself as the rightful heir to everything I'd built. After the service, Elena Cortez introduced herself to the family, expressing condolences and sharing memories of their beloved Evelyn. They accepted her presence without question, too focused on their own performances to scrutinize a supposed family friend. Evelyn spoke of you so often, I told Diana, watching her face light up with pleasure. She was so proud of your success. The lie came easily, though the truth was that I'd rarely mentioned Diana except to complain about her constant requests for loans and her attempts to manipulate our mother before she died. She was wonderful, Diana replied, her voice catching slightly. We were so close. Another fiction. We'd barely spoken in recent months except when she needed money or wanted to complain about some perceived slight. I spent the evening at the post-funeral gathering, moving through the crowd and listening to conversations that revealed the true nature of my relationships. Business associates spoke respectfully about my achievements, but were already positioning themselves to work with Richard in the future. Friends shared genuine memories, but were clearly uncomfortable with the family's obvious eagerness to discuss practical matters so soon after my death. The most revealing moment came when I overheard Marcus talking to his girlfriend about their plans for his inheritance. She always said I reminded her of Grandpa, he was saying. I think she saw me as the one who really understood business. The delusion was staggering. I'd actually considered Marcus one of the least capable members of the family, someone who'd coasted on charm and family connections without ever developing real skills. By the end of the week, I'd gathered enough evidence to destroy their reputations and their legal standing. Financial records showed Diana had been embezzling from our mother's trust fund for years. Email correspondence revealed Charlotte's systematic campaign to isolate David from me. Phone records documented Richard's affair and his discussions with his mistress about my supposed declining mental state. But the most damaging evidence was their own words and actions following my death. The recordings showed a family so consumed with greed that they'd immediately abandoned any pretense of grief or respect. Their conversations revealed plans to sell the business, liquidate assets, and divide the proceeds without any consideration for my actual wishes or the people who'd helped build the company. The will reading was scheduled for Friday afternoon at the offices of Harrison and Associates, the law firm that had handled my family's legal affairs for decades. What my family didn't know was that I'd been working with a different firm, Santos and Partners, to restructure my estate completely. The will that Harrison and Associates would read was not the document my family expected. Thursday evening, I made my final preparations as Elena Cortez visited the family one last time to express her sympathies and gratitude for their kindness during this difficult period. They welcomed me warmly, still seeing only a harmless family friend rather than the architect of their impending downfall. "I know this is presumptuous," I said to Richard as the visit concluded, "but Evelyn mentioned that you'd be handling her final affairs. Would it be appropriate for me to attend the will reading? She spoke so often about wanting to ensure her wishes were honored properly." Richard's hesitation was brief. He was confident that the will would award him control of everything, so witnesses to his victory would only enhance his triumph. "Of course," he said graciously. "Evelyn would want her closest friends there to see how her legacy continues." As I drove back to the safe house that final evening, I reflected on what the next day would bring. In less than 18 hours, my family would gather to claim their expected inheritance, confident in their performances and secure in their deceptions. Instead, they would face the consequences of their greed and discover that the woman they'd underestimated for so long had orchestrated the most comprehensive revenge any of them could imagine. But this wasn't just about punishment. It was about justice. Every employee who'd wondered about the future of the company, every genuine friend who'd been manipulated by my family's false narratives, every person who'd been hurt by their selfishness deserved to see the truth revealed. Tomorrow, Evelyn, Chambers would rise from the dead to deliver that truth personally. The alarm clock read 6 a.m. when I began my final transformation. In a few hours, Elena Cortez would walk into that law office as a respected family friend. By the end of the meeting, Evelyn Chambers would be standing before her family, very much alive and ready to reveal the depths of their betrayal. I applied the makeup carefully, removing the subtle alterations that had disguised my features for the past week. The wig came off, replaced by my natural hair styled exactly as it had been before my supposed death. The simple Elena Cortez wardrobe was exchanged for the sharp business attire that had been Evelyn Chambers' signature look. Looking. In the mirror, I saw the woman my family thought they'd buried 3 days ago. The woman they'd mourned in public while celebrating in private. The woman whose legacy they'd planned to dismember and whose memory they'd already begun rewriting to suit their narratives. But I also saw something they'd never recognized. The intelligence that had built a multi-million-dollar business from nothing. The strategic mind that had outmaneuvered competitors for decades. And the patience that had allowed me to plan this moment for months while they revealed their true natures. At 2 p.m., I would walk into that conference room and destroy every assumption they'd made about power, control, and consequences. The empty casket they'd buried contained nothing but their own greed and deception, returned to the earth where it belonged. It was time for the dead to deliver their judgment on the living. The Harrison and Associates conference room hummed with anticipation as my family gathered for what they believed would be their moment of triumph. I watched from the parking lot as they arrived, each playing their part in the final act of their deception. Richard pulled up in his Mercedes, straightening his black tie with the practiced solemnity of a man who'd rehearsed grief in the mirror. Diana emerged from her BMW wearing widow's weeds that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her designer handbag clutched like a talisman of impending wealth. At exactly 2:15 p.m., I entered the building through the side entrance. Maria Santos had arranged. The elevator ride to the 7th floor felt like ascending to Judgment Day, which in a sense it was. Through the conference room's glass walls, I could see my family already seated around the mahogany table, their body language revealing everything. Their words had hidden for years. David sat rigidly beside Charlotte, who was whispering reassurances in his ear, while her eyes calculated the room's expensive furnishings. Marcus sprawled in his chair with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never earned anything in his life but expected everything. Diana had positioned herself at Richard's right hand, already establishing herself as his chief ally in whatever power structure would emerge. Attorney Harrison stood at the head of the table, a thick will folder before him, unaware that the document inside would soon become irrelevant. Maria Santos sat quietly in the corner, introduced as a legal observer but actually the architect of what was about to unfold. "Before we begin," Harrison announced, "I should mention that a family friend, Elena Cortez, has requested to attend. Mrs. Chambers apparently considered her quite close." He gestured toward the door, and I entered as Elena one final time. "Thank you for allowing me to be here," I said softly, taking a seat near the back. "Evelyn meant so much to me." The performance was almost over. In minutes, Elena would disappear, forever, and Evelyn would reclaim her life. Richard nodded graciously, his smile confident. "Evelyn always spoke fondly of you. She'd want you here for this." The condescension in his tone was subtle, but unmistakable. He was already practicing the voice of a man who controlled millions. Harrison cleared his throat and opened the folder. "This is the last will and testament of Evelyn Margaret Chambers. Dated?" He paused, frowning. "This is unusual. There seem to be two documents here." Maria Santos stood smoothly. "If I may explain, Mr. Harrison, Mrs. Chambers executed a new will 6 months ago through our firm. The document you're holding is superseded." She approached the table with a briefcase, her movements precise and professional. "What?" Diana's voice cracked slightly. "That's impossible. Mother would have told us about any changes." "Would she?" Maria asked mildly, opening her briefcase. "According to our records, Mrs. Chambers was quite specific about maintaining confidentiality until after her death." She placed a thick document on the table. "This is the valid will, properly executed and witnessed." I watched the color drain from Richard's face as Harrison examined the new document. His hands trembled slightly as he read the opening paragraphs, and I knew the moment he reached the crucial section. "This is highly irregular," he said finally. "The language here is quite specific about circumstances that would void bequests." "What circumstances?" Charlotte demanded, her carefully controlled voice beginning to fray. Maria smiled coldly. "Perhaps we should read the document aloud, as Mrs. Chambers requested. She was quite insistent that every word be heard by all parties present." Richard leaned forward, his mask of grief slipping. "Just tell us what it says. We don't need theatrical presentations." "Actually," I said quietly from the back of the room, "I think a full reading would be appropriate. Evelyn always believed in transparency." Something in my voice made David turn around. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw confusion flicker across his face. Recognition was close, hovering at the edges of his consciousness like a half-remembered dream. Harrison began reading, his voice growing more uncomfortable with each paragraph. "I, Evelyn Margaret Chambers, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. I am deeply troubled by certain behaviors I have observed in my family members, behaviors that reveal their true characters and motivations." "What the hell does that mean?" Marcus interrupted. "It means," Maria said smoothly, "that Mrs. Chambers was aware of certain activities that occurred before and after her death." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see wheels turning in their minds, memories surfacing of conversations they thought were private, actions they believed were unobserved. Harrison continued, reading, though his voice had become strained. "To my husband, Richard Chambers, who has shared my bed for 25 years while sharing his heart with another woman, I leave the knowledge that his betrayal did not go unnoticed. His inheritance consists of the divorce papers filed 6 months ago and the documentation of his adultery that will ensure he receives nothing in our property settlement. Richard shot to his feet so violently his chair toppled backward. That's impossible. She was dying. She couldn't have filed anything. Couldn't she? Maria asked, producing a thick folder. Evelyn Chambers was quite active in the months before her death. Remarkably productive, actually. I stood slowly, my heart pounding, with anticipation. The moment had arrived. She was indeed quite busy. Every head in the room turned toward me, and I watched as recognition dawned on their faces like a slow-motion explosion. Diana's hand flew to her throat. Marcus's mouth fell open. Charlotte grabbed David's arm so tightly her knuckles went white. "No," Richard whispered, his face gray with shock. "No, that's impossible. You're dead. We buried you." I smiled, removing the subtle contact lenses that had changed my eye color, the padding that had altered my silhouette, the hairpiece that had disguised my natural color. With each change, Elena Cortez disappeared and Evelyn Chambers emerged. "You buried an empty casket, Richard. Or rather, you buried Margaret Thornfield, a poor woman who died alone while you planned your celebration." I moved toward the table, my voice growing stronger with each step. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice your affair? Your plans? Your complete lack of grief at my supposed death?" Diana found her voice first, though it came out as a croak. "This is insane. You can't fake your own death. It's illegal. So is embezzling from trust funds," I replied mildly. "So is adultery in a marriage with an infidelity clause. So is fraud, conspiracy, and about a dozen other crimes you've all committed in the past week alone." I reached the head of the table and gestured for Harrison to continue reading. The poor man looked like he was witnessing the resurrection, which in a sense he was. "To my sister Diana," Harrison read with a shaking voice, "who has spent decades manipulating our mother's trust fund and planning to do the same with my estate, I leave the detailed financial records of her embezzlement and the promise that the authorities will receive copies immediately following this reading." Diana's designer composure cracked completely. "You can't prove anything. Those were legitimate expenses." I pulled out my phone and played a recording of her voice from just 2 days ago. The old bitch finally croaked. "Now we can access that. Trust fund properly and liquidate everything before anyone notices the shortfalls." Recognizable voice, don't you think? I asked conversationally. The audio quality is excellent. Maria's team used professional equipment. Marcus was staring at me like I was a ghost, which I suppose I was. "This is impossible," he kept repeating. "This is impossible." "What's impossible?" I said. "Is that you thought you could mock me at my own funeral and get away with it? Did you really think I wouldn't hear you planning to use your inheritance to buy a Lamborghini? At my wake, Marcus. You were planning sports car purchases. At my wake." Harrison's voice had become mechanical as he continued reading. "To my nephew Marcus, who has never held a job for more than 6 months, but expects to inherit the rewards of a lifetime's work, I leave the knowledge that his trust fund has been donated to workforce development programs. Perhaps others will benefit from opportunities he chose to waste." "You can't do this," Marcus shouted, jumping to his feet. "I'm family. You owe me." "I owe you nothing," I replied coldly. "I gave you opportunities, education, connections. You repaid me with laziness, entitlement, and the assumption that my death would solve your financial problems." Charlotte had been silent throughout the revelations, but I could see her calculating mind working frantically. She was the smartest of them, the most dangerous, and I had saved special attention for her. "To my daughter-in-law Charlotte," Harrison read, "who has systematically poisoned my relationship with my son while positioning herself to inherit through manipulation rather than affection, I leave the complete record of her campaign to isolate David from his family and the evidence of her multiple affairs during their marriage." David turned to stare at his wife, confusion and betrayal warring on his face. "Affairs? What affairs? Charlotte's mask finally slipped completely. David, honey, she's lying. She's clearly mentally ill. People don't come back from the dead to read wills. I placed a tablet on the table and pressed play. Security footage from 3 different hotels played simultaneously, showing Charlotte with 3 different men over the past year. The timestamp showed dates when she'd claimed to be visiting her sick mother. The investigators were very thorough, I said quietly. Amazing what people will do when they think no one is watching. David's face had gone white. He looked between his wife and me, struggling to process the complete destruction of his reality. Mom, you're really alive? But we buried you. We mourned you. You buried a stranger, I said gently, my voice softening for the one person in the room who might still deserve compassion. And you mourned the inheritance, not the person. Harrison continued reading, though his voice was barely audible. To my son David, who I hoped would remain untainted by greed, but who proved susceptible to his wife's manipulation, I leave a choice. He may claim his full inheritance, but only after divorcing Charlotte and undergoing counseling to understand how easily he was manipulated. David stared at the document, then at Charlotte, then at me. The weight of what he'd lost, not just his mother, but his integrity, his judgment, his marriage, was crushing him visibly. The remainder of my estate, Harrison continued, valued at approximately $22 million, will be placed in a trust for charitable purposes if my family cannot demonstrate genuine remorse and changed behavior within 1 year. 22 million? Richard's voice was a strangled whisper. You're giving away $22 million? I'm giving you a chance to earn it, I corrected. Something none of you have ever done before. You have 1 year to prove you're capable of genuine human decency rather than performative grief. Maria Santos stepped forward, her briefcase open and documents ready. The legal proceedings begin immediately. Divorce papers for Richard, fraud charges for Diana, annulment options for David, and restraining orders for anyone who attempts to contest these arrangements. The room erupted in protests, threats, and desperate bargaining attempts. Richard tried to grab my arm, earning himself a warning from the security officers Maria had positioned outside. Diana screamed about family loyalty while simultaneously calling her lawyer. Marcus simply sat down hard and began crying. Real tears, possibly the first genuine emotion he'd shown all week. But I focused on David, who sat in stunned silence as his world collapsed around him. Of all of them, he was the only one who seemed to understand the true cost of what had happened. Why? He asked quietly, his voice cutting through the chaos. Why go this far? Why fake your death? I sat down beside him, ignoring the others' continued protests. Because I needed to see who you really were when you thought no one was watching. I needed to know if the son I raised still existed underneath Charlotte's influence. And? He looked up at me, eyes wet with tears that seemed genuine. That depends on what you do next, I said honestly. The man who went through my jewelry with a price list isn't the boy I raised, but the man asking why might still be my son? Charlotte chose that moment to make her play. This is kidnapping, fraud. She's probably having a mental breakdown. David, we need to call the police. David looked at his wife, really looked at her. For what might have been the first time in years. You were planning to sell Mom's jewelry, he said slowly. Before we even buried her. David, honey, you're in shock. You're not thinking clearly. Actually, he said, standing up slowly, I think I'm thinking clearly for the first time in years. He turned to me. What kind of counseling? The question hung in the air like a lifeline. Of all the outcomes I'd planned for, this was the one I'd hoped for but hadn't dared expect. The kind that helps you understand how someone who loved you could become a stranger to you, I said carefully. The kind that helps you figure out who you are when you're not being told who to be. Richard had moved beyond anger into desperate negotiation. Evelyn, please, we can work this out. The affair meant nothing. I was confused, grief-stricken over your illness. I wasn't ill, Richard. That was part of the deception. Dr. Martinez has been documenting your behavior for months, while you thought I was dying. I turned to face him fully. You moved Jennifer into our house 72 hours after my funeral. You were grief-stricken about having to wait 3 whole days. The evidence was overwhelming, the deception complete. One by one, my family members were escorted from the building by security, their protests echoing down the hallway. Only David remained, sitting in the conference room like a man trying to remember how to breathe. The house, he said finally. The business. What happens to all of it? That depends on you, I replied. And on whether you can learn to see the difference between love and control, between loyalty and manipulation. I handed him a card with Dr. Sarah Mitchell's information. She specializes in helping people recover from psychological manipulation. If you're serious about understanding what happened to you, start there. David took the card, studying it like it held the secrets of the universe. And if I do this, if I get help, what then? Then we'll see if there's anything left of my son underneath the man Charlotte created. As the conference room emptied, I stood at the window looking down at the parking lot where my family's cars were pulling away. Each of them would face consequences: legal, financial, and social. Richard would find his assets frozen and his affair exposed publicly. Diana would face embezzlement charges that could result in prison time. Marcus would discover that unemployment was more challenging when you couldn't rely on family wealth. And Charlotte would learn that manipulation only works when your victims don't realize they're being manipulated. But the real victory wasn't in their punishment. It was in the possibility that David might still choose to save himself. The son I'd raised was still in there somewhere, buried under years of toxic influence but not destroyed. Phase 2 complete, Maria said quietly, joining me at the window. I nodded, watching David's car disappear into traffic. Now we wait and see if resurrection is possible for the living as well as the dead. The will reading was over, but the real test was just beginning. I had returned from the dead to deliver justice, but justice without redemption was just elaborate revenge. The next year would determine whether my family could earn their way back to humanity, or whether they would remain the hollow shells their greed had created. Either way, Evelyn Chambers was no longer dead, and she had work to do. 6 months after my resurrection, I stood in the rebuilt conference room of Chambers Enterprises, watching through the floor-to-ceiling windows as autumn painted the city in shades of gold and crimson. The company had undergone its own transformation during my absence from the dead, a metamorphosis that proved sometimes destruction was necessary before true growth could begin. The quarterly board meeting was about to commence, but this gathering would be different from any in the company's 30-year history. For the first time, my family members would face the consequences of their choices not as entitled heirs, but as individuals who had to earn their place in the world. Maria Santos entered with her characteristic precision, carrying files that represented months of legal proceedings, investigations, and carefully orchestrated justice. The final reports are in, she announced, settling into the chair beside mine. Every legal challenge has been dismissed. The fraud charges against Diana are proceeding to trial. Richard's divorce is finalized with the prenup enforced to the letter. I nodded, though my attention remained focused on the parking lot below. In exactly 15 minutes, David would arrive for his appointment, the culmination of 6 months of therapy, self-reflection, and the slow, painful process of rebuilding a personality that had been systematically dismantled by manipulation. "How is he progressing?" Maria asked, following my gaze. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had provided regular updates throughout David's treatment, with his permission. The journey had been brutal, confronting years of psychological manipulation, understanding how his own desperate need for approval had made him vulnerable, and learning to distinguish between love and control. Some days he'd made progress, others he'd backslid into old patterns of thinking. "He's fighting," I said simply. "The question is whether he's fighting for the right reasons." The past 6 months had been revelatory in ways I hadn't anticipated. Watching my family face real consequences for their actions had provided less satisfaction than I'd expected. Revenge, I'd discovered, was like a rich dessert, delicious in small quantities, but nauseating when consumed in excess. Richard had proven the most predictable in his downfall. Stripped of his expected inheritance and exposed publicly for his adultery, he'd descended into a spiral of blame and self-pity that cost him his remaining professional relationships. His former mistress, Jennifer, had abandoned him once his financial prospects evaporated, leaving him alone in a studio apartment with nothing but his wounded pride and mounting legal bills. The divorce proceedings had been swift and merciless. The prenuptial agreement he'd insisted upon, designed to protect his modest assets from my considerable wealth, had instead protected my empire from his grasping hands. He'd walked away, with exactly what he'd brought to the marriage: a mid-level sales position and a used Honda Civic. The poetic justice was almost too perfect. Diana's fate had unfolded more dramatically. The embezzlement charges had triggered a federal investigation that uncovered years of financial manipulation spanning multiple family trusts and charitable organizations. She'd stolen not just from our mother's estate, but from a children's cancer foundation where she'd served as treasurer. The evidence was overwhelming, the sentencing guidelines harsh. Her trial had become a media sensation. Society Sisters' secret schemes dominated the tabloids for weeks. The public revelation of her crimes had destroyed her social standing more thoroughly than any prison sentence could. Former friends refused her calls, charities demanded repayment, and her membership at the country club was quietly revoked. Marcus had perhaps faced the most educational consequences. Stripped of his trust fund and family connections, he'd been forced to confront the reality of earning a living without privilege to smooth his path. The experience had been humbling in ways I couldn't have orchestrated deliberately. His first job applications had been disasters. Decades of entitlement had left him unprepared for actual interviews with people who weren't impressed by his family name. Fast food restaurants rejected him for being overqualified but undermotivated. Retail positions lasted only days before his attitude problems surfaced. Currently, he was working as a night security guard at a shopping mall, a position that paid barely enough to cover rent on a shared apartment. The irony wasn't lost on him. He spent his nights protecting other people's property while contemplating how thoroughly he'd squandered his own opportunities. But Charlotte's downfall had been the most complex to watch. Unlike the others, she possessed genuine intelligence and manipulative skills that made her dangerous even in defeat. Exposed and divorced, she'd attempted to reinvent herself as a victim of circumstances, spinning narratives about controlling in-laws and impossible expectations. Her strategy had initially shown promise. She'd found sympathetic audiences among certain women's groups, portraying herself as a wife destroyed by an unstable mother-in-law's posthumous revenge. She'd even secured a few speaking engagements about surviving toxic family dynamics. The facade had crumbled when Maria's investigators released additional evidence: recordings of Charlotte coaching David on how to manipulate me, emails detailing her affairs, and financial records showing how she'd systematically isolated him from friends and family while building her own network of potential replacements. The revelation had been devastating not just professionally, but personally. Charlotte's own family, previously supportive, had distanced themselves as the extent of her deception became clear. Her mother, a woman I'd actually respected, had publicly apologized for her daughter's behavior and expressed hope that David would find peace. These victories, however, felt hollow as I waited for David's arrival. Of all the family members, he was the only one whose fate still hung in the balance, the only one whose redemption remained possible. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. "Mrs. Chambers? David is here." I turned from the window, straightening my jacket. The next hour would determine whether the past 6 months of struggle had produced genuine change or merely another performance. David entered the conference room. Cautiously, his appearance markedly different from the last time I'd seen him. The expensive clothes had been replaced with simple, well-fitted attire that suggested practicality over status. His face carried the drawn look of someone who'd spent months confronting uncomfortable truths about himself. Most notably, he was alone. No Charlotte whispering instructions, no enablers reinforcing his victim narrative. For the first time in years, David faced a family situation without a handler. "Mom," he said quietly, the single word carrying months of therapy and self-reflection. "Thank you for seeing me." I gestured to the chair across from mine, noting how he moved with new awareness of space and boundaries. Dr. Mitchell had emphasized the importance of teaching him to navigate relationships without constant external guidance. "How are you feeling?" I asked, the question both conventional and loaded with significance. David considered his answer carefully, another sign of progress. The old David would have provided an immediate, rehearsed response designed to elicit the reaction he thought I wanted. "Terrified," he said finally. "Angry at myself. Hopeful, maybe, for the first time in years. But mostly terrified." He met my eyes directly. "I'm starting to understand how completely I lost myself, and I'm not sure who I am without all the manipulation." The honesty was stark, painful, and genuine. This was not the polished performance I'd grown accustomed to from him. "Dr. Mitchell says you've been working on understanding how the manipulation began," I said carefully. "How you became vulnerable to it." David's face tightened, but he didn't look away. "It started with Dad, didn't it? His approval was always conditional, always dependent on being the right kind of son. When Charlotte came along, she offered unconditional acceptance, but the price was agreeing with her about everything else. The insight was crucial. Richard's emotional distance had created a void that Charlotte had exploited, offering the acceptance David craved while systematically turning him against anyone who might interfere with her control. I convinced myself that choosing her side was love," he continued. "But it was really just trading one form of control for another. I never learned to think for myself because there was always someone telling me what the right answer was." Maria Santos had prepared extensive documentation of Charlotte's manipulation, techniques, patterns that matched textbook cases of psychological abuse. The process had been gradual, almost imperceptible, designed to make David dependent on her judgment while believing he was making his own choices. "What do you want now?" I asked directly. "From me? From your life? From yourself?" David was quiet. For a long moment, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I want to earn the right to call myself your son again. Not because of inheritance or obligation, but because I've become someone worthy of the name Chambers." "And how do you propose to do that?" "I've been thinking about the business," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Not about inheriting it, but about understanding it, about learning how you built something from nothing and what it means to create value rather than just extract it." I raised an eyebrow. This was not what I'd expected. "I want to start at the bottom," David continued, the words coming faster now. "Entry level, minimum wage, whatever position you think might teach me something. I want to understand what you built and why it mattered to you." The proposal was shocking in its humility. The David who'd sat in this office 6 months ago would never have considered anything below an executive position. The man sitting across from me now was requesting the opportunity to earn his place. "You understand that working for Chambers Enterprises doesn't guarantee anything?" I said carefully. "No special treatment, no fast track to management, no guarantee that you'll prove capable of the work?" "I understand. I also understand that I need to prove to myself that I can succeed or fail on my own merit. I've never done that before." Maria Santos leaned forward, her legal mind engaging with the implications. What about the will provisions? The inheritance clause? I'd almost forgotten about the conditional inheritance I'd established. If David completed therapy and demonstrated genuine change, he could claim his portion of the estate. But his current proposal suggested he might be moving beyond the financial motivations that had driven his previous behavior. I don't want the inheritance, David said quietly. Not now, maybe not ever. I need to know who I am when money isn't a factor in my decisions. The statement hit me like a physical blow. Of all the outcomes I'd planned for, this complete rejection of material motivation hadn't been among them. David, I said carefully, you're talking about giving up millions of dollars to work minimum wage jobs. Are you certain this isn't another form of self-punishment? Dr. Mitchell asked me the same question. I've thought about it extensively. He looked up at me with eyes that seemed clearer than they'd been in years. I think the inheritance would always be a crutch. I'd always wonder if I earned anything myself or if it was just family money smoothing the way. The wisdom in his response was startling. He was choosing the difficult path not as penance, but as a prerequisite for authentic self-respect. There's something else, David continued. I want to make amends to the people Charlotte and I hurt. The employees who were passed over for promotions because of our interference. The family friends who were cut off because they didn't support our narrative. I want to understand the damage we caused and find ways to repair it. I felt something shift inside me, a warmth I hadn't experienced since before the deception began. This wasn't the manipulated son or the entitled heir. This was someone I didn't quite recognize but was beginning to respect. What about Charlotte? I asked. She's been trying to contact you. David's expression hardened. She's trying to convince me that this is all temporary insanity, that I should challenge the will and force a reconciliation. She doesn't understand that I'm not trying to get back to where I was. I'm trying to become someone I've never been. The finality in his voice was convincing. Dr. Mitchell had warned that manipulative partners often escalated their efforts when they sensed losing control, but David seemed to have developed genuine immunity to Charlotte's tactics. Very well, I said, making a decision that surprised even me. You can start in the warehouse Monday morning. 7 a.m. shift, loading trucks and processing orders. Supervisor is Jim Patterson. He doesn't know your family, and I won't tell him unless you do. David's face lit up with something I hadn't seen in years, genuine excitement about earning something rather than inheriting it. Thank you, he said simply. I won't disappoint you. Don't do it for me, I cautioned. Do it for yourself. Prove to yourself that you can build something worthwhile. As David left the conference room, I reflected on the unexpected turn of events. The revenge I'd planned had achieved more than I'd hoped. Not just punishment for the guilty, but genuine transformation for the salvageable. Maria Santos gathered her files, pausing at the door. You know, when we started this, I thought it was about justice. But watching David just now, maybe it was about something else entirely. What do you mean? Maybe it was about love. The kind of love that's willing to destroy everything false in order to save what's authentic. After she left, I remained in the conference room as evening shadows lengthened across the city. The past year had taught me that resurrection was possible for the living as well as the dead, but it required a willingness to let old selves die completely before new ones could emerge. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Mitchell. David asked, "Me to tell you that he understands now. The greatest gift a parent can give isn't money or protection from consequences, but the chance to become someone worthy of respect." I smiled, looking out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness. Tomorrow, David would begin his real education, not in manipulation or entitlement, but in the value of honest work and earned respect. The others, Richard, Diana, Marcus, Charlotte, would continue facing the consequences of their choices, Some might eventually find redemption through genuine change. Others would remain trapped in cycles of blame and victimhood. But David had chosen the harder path, the one that led to authentic transformation rather than comfortable delusion. In doing so, he'd given me something I hadn't expected from this elaborate resurrection: hope. The empty casket had indeed been buried, along with the false family dynamics that had poisoned our relationships for years. What emerged from that grave wasn't just my return from the dead, but the possibility that love could survive even the most devastating betrayals if it was strong enough to demand truth over comfort. As I prepared to leave the office, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. The woman looking back was no longer the manipulated wife or the deceived mother. She was someone who had died to illusions and been reborn into clarity. Sometimes, I realized, the dead have to rise not for revenge, but to teach the living how to live authentically. The greatest victory wasn't in destroying my enemies, but in saving the one person who still had the courage to change. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for growth and redemption. But tonight, for the first time in years, I felt genuinely hopeful about the future. The resurrection was complete, but the real work of living was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.